Great. Thank you so much, Chris. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeannette Sutton, who's an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University at Albany, SUNY. Dr. Sutton earned her Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and specializes in disaster and risk, specifically focusing on informal communications that occur online, in addition to public alerts and warnings shared on channels such as Twitter. Her research investigates the evolving role of information and communication technology, including social media and mobile devices, for disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sutton as she presents to us tonight the science of communicating about weather hazards.
Thank you very much for inviting me tonight. I thought I'd just say hello visually, and then I'm going to share my screen and then turn off my camera. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this evening and to talk to you a little bit about the science of communicating about weather hazards, which I'm also calling how science can improve public weather messages. I joined the faculty in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity about 2 years ago. Moved into the brand new building of eTech this last fall and have been thrilled to have the opportunity to work with some of the faculty who are part of Atmospheric Sciences Research Center and also with the Department of Atmospheric and Environmental Sciences. And we've talked quite a bit about how a social scientist approaches weather phenomena and thinks about how to communicate weather to people who are at risk. And so I wanted to spend some time tonight talking about those different things that we do within my lab and within social sciences to actually measure how we can improve messaging to people who are at risk. In preparation for this, I spent some time thinking about we're looking at warnings for weather hazards. I'm not trained as an atmospheric scientist and have learned a lot about weather hazards in the last 10 years or so, but I'm not an expert in it. And I wanted to know more about the history of weather hazards and how it fits into weather warnings fits into disaster warnings, which is where I've spent most of my career. And I found that in as early as 1884, it's probably familiar to many of you, experimental tornado forecasting began in the US Army Signal Corps. And then 1891, the US Weather Bureau began to issue public flood warnings. In 1912, the US Weather Bureau began to issue fire weather forecasts, and there was a hurricane warning service established in 1935. I was surprised to learn that in 1947, the Federal Aviation Administration issued an urgent special observation, which was a tornado warning, but there was a real problem in the Weather Bureau about issuing warnings. And it was because they were concerned that issuing a warning would cause unnecessary fright about the tornado warnings, which would be worse than the storms themselves. So I was a little bit surprised about that. But because of this concern that it existed in the first part of the 1900s, all of the forecasters had been prevented from actually sending out weather warnings for tornadoes. So for several decades, the Weather Bureau employees did not issue tornado messages, partly due to fear of disciplinary measures. Thinking about how this kind of fits in with the disaster warning area and history, there were similar concerns in the earliest studies of human behavior in disaster. Maybe that's not surprising, but around that same time in the 1950s, the Department of Defense commissioned the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago to study the psychological reactions and behaviors of individuals and local population in disaster for the purpose of developing methods for the prevention of panic and for minimizing emotional and psychological failures, which sounds an awful lot like the unnecessary fright that would come along with issuing a tornado warning. And so there's been this concern among those who have been responsible for issuing forecasts and warnings for different kinds of hazards that if we issue a warning, it's going to cause people to be panicked, to be out of control, to be irrational, and that we need to figure out ways to prevent and minimize those kinds of emotional impacts that come with the dissemination of warnings. But there's a lot of misconceptions about human behavior that has affected the design of alerts and warnings. And we've learned this through all of our research from the last 70 years. First is that people do not generally panic in response to an alert or a warning. So this is one of those misconceptions. Panic in the media is often loosely described as any fear, flight, or uncoordinated activity. So if you imagine, there were a lot of images that came out after 9/11 of people running through the streets of New York City away from the towers as they were collapsing, and you see this cloud of dust behind them. That was described in the media as panic, but what it is actually is it's rational behavior where people are in fear and they're running away from the danger. But we have seen it characterized as panic so often, we begin to believe that panic is a really horrible response. And so there have been decisions about not issuing warnings for fear of causing panic. But you'll find out soon that if you restrict the issuing of warnings, that actually results in worse things. The second thing is that people do not automatically take action in response to an alert or warning. It's more difficult to get people to take a protective action than it is likely that you're going to get people to automatically respond, which is, you probably have seen this frequently with the issuance of hurricane warnings, where it's so difficult to get people to pay attention to the warning, to interpret it correctly, or in the way that you want them to interpret it, and then to take the action that you're recommending. So frequently people choose to ignore the information or to make choices based upon their previous behavior, their previous experiences, where they haven't actually been directly affected by the threat itself, or others are making decisions around them to not act on that protective action information. So getting people to actually act in response to a warning is more difficult, and it should be a greater concern than worrying about people panicking, which was what the earliest people within the Department of Defense and the Weather Bureau were concerned about. So we have over 70 years of research on alerts and warnings now. And the challenge is to convince the public that they're at risk and to motivate them to act in a timely manner. When we think about this challenge, there are some ways that we might automatically respond. I came up with a couple of things. We could say, well, if we just tell them what to do, they'll do what we say. Well, that's not really true, because a lot of people are going to have reasons not to just automatically follow what has been told to them. We have to figure out different ways of expressing and providing information to people so that they can interpret it in such a way that it promotes action rather than reaction. If we just tell people the science, they'll do what we say. Well, scientists are very good at creating information about the hazard itself and about impacts, but that doesn't always translate into action on the other end if we don't understand what we're supposed to do in response to that threat. So then how about if we just tell people something scarier, then they'll do what we say? Well, not really, because just scaring people into acting is not always the best motivation to getting people to act. People also have to believe they can do something to protect themselves, which means you have to also promote what we call efficacy as part of the message, giving them not only the information about the hazard and its impacts, but also what people can do in response is the best combination. And I'm going to show you how we come to that conclusion in just a second. So the response to warning messages is a complex socio-behavioral process. This is a model that's based upon the work by Dennis Milletti and John Sorensen. It was created based upon the compilation of empirical research from the 1950s to the 1990s, and they created this model where initially a person must receive a message through whatever channel they're receiving it through and from whatever source they're receiving it from, to shift them from a perception of safety to a perception of risk so that they might have a behavioral response. This does not happen at only the individual level. It happens at a social level as well. But at the individual level, we have to receive those messages, and then we go through a series of message perception activities. We have to understand the message. We have to believe that the message is true and accurate and that the threat is real. We have to then personalize that information, believing that it's actually going to affect me, myself, in the area around me, or the people that I'm concerned about. And then we also have to decide what to do, what actions to take based upon the information that's contained in that message. The social part is what we call milling, which is message confirmation, where while people are processing the information in that message, they're also confirming information at the same time. And that frequently takes place as people are interacting with others, searching for information on their cell phones, turning to the news, going outside and looking at the weather, and looking around them to see what others are doing. Even in those events where we're trained to respond pretty quickly, such as a fire alarm inside of a building, we will not automatically get up and leave a building. We will instead look around at each other, look out the window if there's some sort of a signal outside. Somebody will probably go out and look in the hallways, and then maybe somebody will lead the effort of saying we need to leave the building. But that doesn't happen automatically. It's a process, and that's what we call milling. So there's some things that we found in messages that affect people's shift from that perception of safety to risk, things that need to be included in order to help people to take that behavioral response. Those are our message contents. And we've narrowed it down to 5 primary things that people need to know about the hazard and its impact or the consequences on them and their environment. They need to know what to do in response to that hazard and those consequences to reduce the impact. They need to know what location is affected by the hazard or the population in that location. They need to know what time the event is going to occur and what time they need to take the action by. They also need to know who the message is from, and it should be from an authoritative source. So we can manipulate those message contents in such a way to increase the message perceptions and decrease that message confirmation activity so that people can move more quickly to that behavioral response. Milling is an activity that delays protective actions. And so we really want to increase the understanding and the believing and the deciding in order to move them towards protective actions more quickly. In some hazards and threats, such as health-related hazards, we want people to search for more information. So increasing people's ability to look for information is a good thing. But in really fast-moving threats, where people need to respond very, very quickly, we want to decrease that uncertainty, decrease the need to search for more information and to confirm with others so that they can initiate protective action more quickly. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study that we've been doing for several years now. It's funded by NOAA and the VORTEX Southeast program. It's with a colleague of mine from Texas Tech University. We started this when I was at the University at Kentucky, so I suppose it's been about 3 years now since we started this project, and it's called Eye Tracking the Storm. And we call it that because we use eye tracking methods as one of our methods to look at the messages that we've designed to share with our participants. So I'm going to take you through the beginning research to about the middle point of the research that we've been doing. I'm going to share with you 3 or 4 different methods and then talk to you about where we're going next, and then I'll open up for questions. So first of all, eye tracking. So eye tracking takes place in the lab. We put people in front of a computer. We measure where their pupils focus and how they move across the screen while they're interacting with that visual stimuli. We want to measure people's visual attention to an image on the screen. An image means a graphic as well as text. And we're interested in knowing, where do they focus first on the image and how long does it take them to focus there? We want to know where they're looking at the image. Are they making sense of it by moving around to different places? Are they starting in the top left and moving across the screen? Are they focusing in on one particular area? And then we also want to know about the areas of attention that draw their eyes there for the longest periods of time in terms of settling in on the image. And then we also use something called Think Aloud interviews, and these are used to elicit their verbalized thoughts. So as people are looking at their screens, we want them to think out loud and tell us what they're looking at. So we might guide them as they're looking, if they don't talk the entire time, by asking questions. What are you looking at now? What draws your attention to that? What do you think about that? And we try to make it as open as possible without getting people to focus on a particular thing, because we want their eyes to travel to things that they're interested in and then to talk about it as they're viewing those things. And this helps us to explain the meaning of the eye tracking activities, because with the data that we get back from eye tracking is essentially just fractions of seconds on the screen and patterns that we can view, but we don't know why people are looking at those things and what draws their attention. We can just see where and for how long. So let me show you some of the images that we've shown people for eye tracking the storm. We've been focused on tornado warnings. And so we started our work in Lexington, Kentucky, working with the National Weather Service, Louisville. We have been using their experimental products that come out of the Storm Prediction Center, and they created these kinds of Twitter graphics that are automatically produced. You might also see them from the NWS Twitter account, but these go out attached to the local forecast office, and they're generated every time a warning is generated, a product, and they're sent out through Twitter. And so those individuals that are following the Louisville account would get this message in their Twitter feed. If you're following the Albany account, you get the Albany message, et cetera. So this is probably familiar to many of you, that the content at the top is the information about the tornado, its location and the time. Then it has a red banner across the top. It tells people about the threat information, the tornado and the hail. It also provides some information about potential exposure, the population numbers, the schools and the hospitals that are in the area of potential impact. On the bottom left, it provides a map showing where that polygon is located in the larger blowup of the state and the surrounding states. And then the very large map in the middle shows where the polygon is located with a listing of the different cities and road map lines. So when we are interested in measuring areas of attention, which is what we were looking at in this particular part of the study, we identified different blocks that we would calculate how much time was spent in those different areas. So here we were interested in the logo, the text at the top, the banner, the impact information on the left, the inset map at the bottom left, and the map in the middle, and then the engagement information at the bottom, which is like likes and retweets and that kind of thing. So after we put people in front of the eye tracker, we found that the patterns for the warning message looked like this. People spent a great deal of time looking at the map on the center part of the map. They also looked a lot at the impacts, and they read the text. You can see that the darker red shows that that was the most amount of time spent in that particular area. And the very pale green shows the least amount of time spent. So if you look towards the bottom of the screen, there's very little time spent in the engagement, but a lot of time spent in the map area. So this is what it looks like without the eye tracking over the top of it. So you can compare what people were spending their time on. And when we go back and we look at their Think Aloud interviews, they told us that they were spending time looking at the names of the locations on the map. They were trying to identify where it was going to potentially hit. They were looking at the tornado information, the threat information, what the impacts were. And they had some questions also. The colors drew their eyes, the text drew their eyes, but there were some things that seemed to be missing and things that were included that were a little confusing. For instance, some people asked, why did they need to know about the potential exposure? So our population that was looking at these messages was a university population in Lexington, Kentucky, the University of Kentucky. They didn't understand why they would need to know about who was being exposed. They didn't find that inset map to be terribly helpful. And what they wanted to know is, what are you supposed to do when you get this message? Because that information is missing. So the next slide I'll show you is how much time people actually spent on this particular warning while they were thinking out loud. So you could see that initially there was a very short period of attention, and then we asked them to think out loud about this. In general, you're going to get a very brief amount of time spent on any of these images. You have a very short window to grab people's attention and hope that their eyes settle in on the most important information. Here you see that the overall amount of time that was spent on this was less than 7 seconds. They spent the most time looking at the impacts and understanding the tornado that was radar indicated and the amount of hail they might expect. And then they looked at the map, and then a little bit of time was spent on the tweet copy. And now I need to step back and say, these averages were actually related to the people that we put through the overall experiment where they were not thinking out loud. That makes more sense than they were when they spent time talking out loud. They spent several minutes talking about the image they were looking at. So when you look at the averages across the rest of the participants, this is how much time they spent and where they were looking. So turning to the next message, we also wanted to look at how people interacted with a tornado emergency. Tornado emergency messages are not sent quite as frequently as a tornado warning. They are kind of a pinkish purplish color, and because we recreated this image to show a tornado emergency over Lexington, Kentucky, which I'm not aware has ever happened, we created this, and the color is not perfectly matching with what the National Weather Service uses. But at the top, you see this message includes the words, "This is a tornado emergency for Lexington, Kentucky. To protect your life, take cover now, move to an interior room on the lowest floor of a sturdy building, avoid windows." It also includes underneath that purpley pink banner, the words, "This is a life-threatening situation, seek shelter now." But the rest of the information on the map is pretty similar to what was in the warning. And then you see these are the same kinds of areas of attention that we were interested in seeing with the warning message. Where did people's eyes look? So when we put that together with our eye tracking information and the think aloud information, we see very similar patterns to the warning, except for there was a lot more time spent on the text itself. Remember that text had a lot more information. So as people were telling us what they were paying attention to, they told us they paid attention to the words that were in all caps. And they paid attention to the exclamation point that said now. They noticed that in the banner, underneath the banner, it said, "This is a life-threatening situation." They didn't spend a lot of time focusing on that. It's likely because our areas of interest, when we mapped them out using our software, they were a little too close together to be able to really pull them apart. But as people talked about this, they talked about the importance of that text information to tell them what they needed to do in the text, because it's not included in the graphic itself. They also told us that they didn't understand why the color wasn't red. This color that goes beyond the normal range of green, yellow, orange, red, but into something more pink or purple is very confusing for people who are not familiar with that particular rainbow assortment, which leads to some additional questions about how those emergency messages should be colored. And I believe that they've returned them back to red for more recent hazard events. In terms of how much time people spent overall on the emergency message, they spent a little bit more time, but most of that time was spent on the tweet copy, and the tweet copy was much longer than in the warning. So after we put people in front of the eye tracking machine and collect their gaze patterns and the areas of attention, time spent on those different areas, and also walk them through the think aloud interviews, we also asked them to answer some survey questions. So returning back to that initial image that showed you the different perceptions that individuals have to go through as they're making sense of a message, we ask them questions related to that. And so we show them a post-stimulus survey, and we ask them questions about those perceptions. We ask them, did you understand things like the threat, the impacts, the protective actions? Did you believe the threat and the impacts and the protective actions? Do you personalize that information to your location and to you and to your people around you? And can you decide what to do based upon that, the message itself and the contents? And then do you intend to seek information before taking action? So this is probably not terribly surprising, but the emergency message works much better than the warning message. It outperformed for understanding, for believing, for personalizing, for milling, for deciding. We also included negative emotion in there. But what's important here is that the emergency message, because it included that additional information about what people should do, it meant that people intended to spend less time seeking additional information in that milling activity, and they were much more able to decide what to do in response to that message. By comparison, the warning, people were going to spend a lot of time milling and looking for more information, and they couldn't make a decision about what to do because it didn't include the right information. So as we finished that first part of the study, we knew that we needed to go on and conduct some experiments where we actually manipulated those images to include information and then to compare them one to another to see how those manipulations might change these outcomes for the warning message. So we turned to experimental methods. And here we wanted to know, not just could we manipulate the content of telling people what they should do, but also the structure of the message, where that information might be located on that overall Twitter graphic. We wanted to increase the efficacy that people felt when they saw the message, and efficacy is the belief that you can take the action that's recommended. We wanted to increase people's ability to decide what to do, and we wanted to decrease milling. So we started again with the message that was created by the Storm Prediction Center out of NWS Louisville, which is the same one that you saw before. We called that our control condition. And then we manipulated the graphic in the second message. So you see, instead of having potential exposure, we replaced it with safety information, which says move to an interior room on the lowest floor of a sturdy building and stay away from windows. So we called that the control text and the new graphic. And then the third one, we changed the text at the top and we left the graphic as it was. And now we've taken the words tornado warning and put it in all caps, and we added the protective action statement that says to protect yourself, take cover now, and it's also in all caps. And then in the fourth message, we exposed people to both of those changes. So it's both within the text and within the graphic. So then when we ask people those same questions about understanding and believing and deciding, we found that the message perceptions do change by condition. The one that I have circled here is deciding, which was the one that was the biggest difference when we were looking only at emergency and warning. And here we're just comparing across different versions of warning. But we see that the control condition, which is the blue bar, is outperformed generally by all of the other messages. We see that for deciding, it's significantly improved. We see that for understanding, it's improved. We see that for personalizing, that one we're still kind of trying to figure out why it is that there is a significant difference for personalizing. We think that it's possible that when students were exposed to these particular messages, it was after the pandemic hit. And so they were participating in the experimental conditions from wherever they had gone home to after the campus was closed down and we were no longer having classes in person. So it's possible that they didn't feel that they were as at risk or they couldn't personalize that information as well, because they didn't recognize themselves as being in that environment where the message was being sent. But we don't know because we didn't ask open-ended questions to explore some of that. But then we also see that efficacy is very strongly influenced by changing those message conditions. By adding that additional protective action information, it significantly outperforms the original message. So we've spent some time talking with people in the Storm Prediction Center about how they might change those experimental graphics. They've taken our suggestions to heart and are considering whether or not they should make some adjustments. We've learned that those original graphics, that they were created for a population that was online. They didn't plan for it to be directed specifically to public message receivers or to emergency managers and decision makers. And therefore, they didn't think about who they were specifically designing the message for, which would raise the question of who that population exposure information is designed for. So there's the potential that they might be able to adjust that the categories so that they can include that efficacy information in the message in the graphic, or they might leave it. But they certainly recognize that the efficacy information makes a difference. We also found when we looked at where that information was placed in the message, it didn't really matter if it was placed in the message itself or in the graphic. As long as the efficacy information was placed somewhere in the message, it does increase the overall message effectiveness. So when we met with the Storm Prediction Center and shared these results, and we were in the middle of we were at the beginning of the pandemic, we knew we were not going to be able to get people back into the laboratory to finish our VORTEX research, which was the next step. And so we shifted our plans a little bit, and we took on some additional hazards that they were very interested in. They were also in the process of rolling out the warning messages for snow squall and for dust storm. In particular, they were creating wireless emergency alert messages for those. And so we've taken on additional hazards to study, looking at these same kinds of manipulations across a different set of hazards, where we're also manipulating the original control message and then changing it so we either have efficacy information in the visual or in the text, but looking across the three different hazards. This information was presented at an AMS meeting in January. We're also varying the population experience by looking at whether or not people who have higher warning experience or lower warning experience interpret the messages differently and have higher or lower efficacy in relation to the message they see. The next step, we want to get back into the field now that the pandemic seems to have created an opportunity to do so. And we want to do those Think Aloud interviews, but we want to spend time with the general public and not just with college students. And importantly, when we were doing the Think Aloud interviews, we didn't ask why their attention was drawn to specific things. We asked what their attention was drawn to. So we don't know if they were spending a lot of time on the map and the impacts because they didn't understand it, or because they were trying to make sense of it and personalize the information. And that's a really important piece that we missed in our initial bit of research. And then we're also really interested in looking at post-stimuli interviews. So after someone has viewed the images, we want to know what kind of information they're taking away from the images and from the message text, and what information is stored in their short-term memory. And does it vary by the message structure that they view? If we present everything in text format, will that be stored differently from information that's presented in a text plus a map? And can they retrieve that information when they need to, when they're under imminent threat? So those are our next steps that we intend to take. I'm happy to entertain questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And then if people have their cameras on, they're willing to turn on their cameras, I'd be happy to see you and interact with you and take questions. So thank you very much for your attention.